Hello, my name is Elijah Burwell, and this is my presentation on how the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air relates to Desmond's concepts. I used the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air as my movie choice, and using three scenes to discuss Desmond's concepts, I start with the heartbreaking moment Will's dad left in the show. I remember this episode, watching this as a kid. I used to watch this show a lot as a kid. This is a big one for me. Will Smith is one of my favorite actors. But many African Americans struggle with fatherless homes. It's at almost 50% in a report from 2023, which I'll share at the end of the presentation. The media often discusses this as the reason behind African American delinquent youth behavior, which obviously is false. I mean, there's like a grain of truth, right? But it's there's so much more going on, and it's being ignored, which I believe is due to institutional racism, which comes from our history of racism. And the reasons behind delinquent youth behavior at the individual level as can be from a variety of reasons, which should be addressed as at an individual level. The second scene is the scene about them being jailed, him and his Carlton, Will Smith and Carlton. In this scene, it's very reminiscent of you know back in the day of like the 50s and 60s. We've watched movies in the class on how there was a man trying to free his wife from prison and jail because she was jailed unfairly due to interracial marriage, which today would sound crazy, right? But even today, there are similar situations like this still happening in different ways that we don't really get to see on the news. Um, and though this is a comedy show, comedy's been used to portray awareness and history throughout time, especially in American culture and history. Um, the third scene was them actually discussing it, and it was to compare the different experiences and perspectives between Carlton and Will Smith and how they viewed racism. Carlton felt is a bit more, I feel, might be a little bit more naive, and that's kind of what they were trying to portray with the show. Whereas Will Smith um, has been more exposed to the realities of institutional racism, and so I thought this last scene would be really good for that. And he even says in the quote at the bottom there, "You're going to see a whole lot of it during your lifetime." Um, I will say the part that I find interesting that Will does believe in the system as well as Carlton. He just has a different way of dealing with it. What racial stereotypes or narratives are being reinforced or challenged? Well, I used the quote from the book. Thus, through a self-reinforcing cycle of disadvantage, racial profiling results in more non-whites being arrested, and high levels of non-white arrest rates are marshal's evidence to justify racial profiling. I mean, this logic is a common logic fallacy. If you do that, obviously, right, the stats are going to go up. Uh, Anybody that knows math knows that the equation that doesn't it doesn't work out the way you would think. Um, this act of racial profiling wasn't just a random act from police. It's one that's engraved in the American police institution's history. How does the media portray white normativity, assimilation, criminalization, respectability, or colorblindness? I used the quote. A recent poll reported that 50%, 6% of white Americans believe that the country has made a lot of progress to racial equality over the last 50 years, compared to only 19% of black Americans. Um, the media has portrayed those that assimilate into white normativity will be treated equally, but the reality is that no matter what class African Americans are at, they will still receive that racial discrimination. We could see that even under Obama. The president of the United States, the highest level that you can be in America, and even he was a victim of racism on levels that I I seen a lot of bad stuff about him. That was just not true. In the third clip, I thought was significant for this because Carlton was a good example of how there is a 19% that really do trust and believe in today's modern system, and believe we are going in the right direction. And I think we are going in the right direction because we have more rights for African Americans than we ever have had, since the 50s and 60s. Doesn't mean we have to stop working. It means we have to work harder to ensure that we keep those rights and we can get the further rights that we still that African Americans still need today. There is still a high amount of inequality at an institutional level. How do Desmond's ideas explain what we see in everyday media? Since the presidency of Ronald Reagan, single mothers have been stereotyped as immoral delinquents who have more children in order to collect bigger welfare checks. Absent fathers, however, are mentioned less frequently, a silence that assumes single mothers somehow acted alone in the creation of their babies. This show, I thought, was perfect for this because it's an example of how media portrays stereotypes as African American children not having fathers in their lives being the reason for the behavior. This is just, they use these statistics to try to prove things when, if you have common sense and you have common decency, you know that there's bigger things at play. We know that inequality takes a huge part in that, and our history of just it's just ingrained at an institutional level. And until we change that, and we have not changed that, it's still pretty bad. We're gonna have a lot of work to do still. Extra credit. I used Father's Homes to prove my statistics on this, on how this is a true issue. It's at 44.6% as far as 2023. And this is from an official government source. But the true reason, what I believe, is that this is the intentional economic deprivation of African American men, as well as the mass incarceration of African Americans unfairly, not because they didn't want to be in the home, not because they weren't responsible, but because they were racially profiled. And there's certain disadvantages in the inner cities that have just never been addressed. I believe that a lot of communities and places from the 50s and 60s that we've seen, that history that was rough, those places are still there. They still exist, and not all of them have been built up to standards to meet the demands of everyday American citizens. Thank you for watching my presentation. Have a wonderful day.